Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm so excited to have this conversation with all of you. The topic of our conversation this morning is described in your agenda as the sharing economy. And I want to start by honing in on that term. What do we mean when we're talking about the sharing economy? We certainly hear about it a lot. And we also are using often the term the gig economy. Are these things the same? What's the difference? What do we mean? I'm going to start with Arun, who's written a book called The Sharing Economy. So I think he has a good framework for this.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I called my book The Sharing Economy. My book was called The Sharing Economy Over My Objections. I wanted to call it Crowd-Based Capitalism, but that was an argument that my publisher won, and I'm actually glad that they did. But what we label the sharing economy is really a sort of a pretty radical change in how we organize the world's economic activity, where we moved from the 18th century markets to 20th century organizations that accumulated resources, hired people full-time, and produced the world's goods and services. And at the end of the 20th century, that was the economy in many developed countries. But what we're moving into is a new model where a lot of that activity is decentralized to a crowd of people. The lines between personal and professional blur. The lines between casual labor and full-time work blur. Good examples include Lyft, where a decentralized group of contractors are providing the equivalent of a transportation infrastructure for many cities. Airbnb, where millions of hosts are providing short-term accommodation that you would have had to build hotels and hire people full-time to provide. Etsy, which has the equivalent of 500,000 jobs, people manufacturing and selling things. Each of these models has a platform that connects people who have a decentralized set of resources and labor with a global market. And so that's what we think of as the sharing economy. But I guess it's relevant to this conversation and to this conference because what it promises is a very different future of work, where the norm will not be to work full-time for an organization like it was in the second half of the 20th century, but much more of a freelance or a gig or a decentralized ownership of businesses with access to a global demand pool through a platform.
Sara, can you give us some of the more historical context on that? I know that we see the gig economy as something emerging now from apps like Lyft or from websites like Etsy, but there's also a tradition of independent work in America. What does the kind of bigger picture look like? How much is this new? How much is this old? How does it interact with our institutions?
Yeah, so I would say as we start to look out at this workforce, what's so interesting is we just did a study with Upwork and found that it's about 55 million Americans. And what we really wanted to show is that there are so many different categories of what we call independent work. So you have one big segment that are people who are just traditionally working like a graphic designer or literally an independent contractor, anesthesiologist, and that's what they do. They are independent contractors. They really don't have an employer. In contrast, what we found, and I think this is the most interesting thing, is 26% of that 55 million are moonlighters. Those are full-time professionals, workers, who are engaging in gig work on the side. And I think that what we have to do is see this in the context of income inequality, and that what we're seeing is that people are using gig work and parts of the share economy to supplement income. That's one piece of it. And another piece of it is that people are really putting together this portfolio of work. Now, the historical piece is that it's really clear that we've always had freelancers. You could even look at the beginning of our country, or even the Dutch coming here. We had artisans, we had craft workers. We've always had people who are doing work independently. But what I think is so different is that the 40-hour work week job of the manufacturing era, interestingly enough, will turn out to be the blip in time, not the other way around.
Absolutely.
And what we're really seeing now is, and I think the seminal question for the next 20 years is, if it's in fact true that people are going to put together their lives whether they like it or got there because it feels like an empowering decision, regardless, it's the reality, and we have to start to think about how are we going to make these good jobs. And I think that what that tees up is a whole conversation about what will be this next safety net and how will we get there? How will we transform training? Had a lot of conversation today about education, benefits, and I think that what we will not do is retrofit the New Deal, but instead we'll start to think about what is this next era's workforce and how do we bring everybody along so it's not either or.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about a lot, to your point about how this era of mass employment from manufacturers was really a flash in the pan, we didn't recognize it in that moment as temporary, and we built all of our systems onto it. So we have our benefits system that is largely tied to the idea of employment. We have a lot of workplace protections that are 100% tied to the idea of formal employment. So how do we change our mentality to think about the benefits that people need, not as just a worker, but as a human, a citizen of our society?
So, you know, what I really think that we have to go back to and really own, you know, as in like our brand America is like de Tocqueville, right? Like nobody else has like de Tocqueville going to their country talking about how great they are in building associations. And if we went around here and asked everybody in the audience, you know, what's been really meaningful to you? What organizations have you belonged to? Like everybody would have a story. Like when I was in college, I belonged to this thing and I really cared about it. Or I started to volunteer and this thing was really moving to me. And Robert Putnam wrote so brilliantly in Bowling Alone about the decline. And I think sometimes we think about our economy and our organizations like weather, like it's going to rain today, and therefore that's the reality, as opposed to this is our economy and our political environment, and we have an obligation to start to talk about what will be the next ways that we build these portable benefits. And I just have to say this one thing. I really think it's time in America like that we just stopped hating unions, right? We have to start to say that we want to transform, we want evolution, but this is the major way that workers represent voice in America. And it's up to us to evolve this, but like let's just stop this hating on, because I think that's really holding us back.
I mean, I agree, because in many ways, the conversation today is mixing up two things. One is the status of your work relationship with an institution. Full-time employment is common. And second is the good things that go with it. You know, the benefits, the stability, the insurance, the healthcare, the paid vacations. These are two distinct things. I mean, you know, if you read, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, you get a sense for what full-time employment used to look like, and it didn't look good. And then there was a lot of work that was done through public policy, through the unions. And so we're at a sort of an inflection point in some ways where this new model of work, this new relationship between the individual and the institution is being defined, but it's sitting there without any of the work that has been done around full-time employment. And so, strong provider collectives are certainly one big part of the solution, but just a realization that somehow it's not just that the manufacturing full-time employment era was a blip, but that model of engagement between the worker and the institution didn't come pre-packaged with all of the good things that we associated with it. We built them, and we built them through different sort of stakeholders, and we've got to start doing that again.
Joseph, Lyft is obviously one of the biggest players in the sharing economy, the gig economy. Can you talk from what you're seeing from Lyft drivers? Who are they? What do they need that they aren't getting right now? And kind of what's the direction that you guys are moving in getting them those things?
Sure. So, the typical Lyft driver, and this is borne out by our internal research, but also by research that's been done independently, relies on Lyft not as usually a main source of income. 80% of our drivers drive 15 hours a week or less. There was a recent poll that was done that showed that around 86% of rideshare drivers do so because they value being their own boss and value the flexibility. And in fact, it's the flexibility and the part-time nature of the Lyft platform that allows Lyft to be very different than incumbent transportation providers. A great example of that is, and I'm not trying to shill for the product, but I think it's actually instructive here. A product like Lyft Line, which allows two separate people to share, two strangers to share a ride to a common destination. The reason we're able to do that is not because we have a platform full of drivers who are doing this 50, 60 hours a week, but because we have thousands of drivers who may do this 1 or 2 hours a day. So that is the typical, quote unquote, typical driver. But that being said, Lyft is very aware of the fact that the nature of work is changing. Now, to Sarah's point, I do believe that this has been an issue and that, the quote-unquote independent contractor dilemma has been out there for quite a while, but I do think that the rise of the quote-unquote gig economy has focused a new spotlight on it, and it does require that we start taking a really hard look and beginning the discussion as to how do we create a system that can both protect the flexibility that drivers want, but also provide the security that may normally be associated with traditional employment.
I mean, right, because one of the things holding back people from working Lyft as their full-time work might be that they need those benefits and can't access them outside of the full-time employment, right? Like, it would be good for Lyft if people had that option of getting those benefits without those jobs and could work for Lyft more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I to your second point, it would absolutely be something that we would love to be able to offer our drivers. We try to do everything that we can. As a matter of fact, just yesterday we announced a partnership with the White House and the Department of Health and Human Services, to provide easy access to the Affordable Care Act for our drivers. But there are barriers for us to be able to do more for our drivers, and I think that's why we all came together. It's actually ironic. I'm not sure if you realize this, we're about almost a year to the day from when everybody on the stage, or at least the entities that we represent, signed on to a pledge to try to start this conversation about portable benefits. And for what it's worth, from my opinion, I think it's been a really fantastic discussion that we've had for the last year, but I think we're now getting to the point where we need to take the past discussion.
And I think, one of the things that I think we can reflect on about what did we learn in the last year, and what we learned is that the laws are really federally based and the appetite for experimentation is really local. And so it's been very hard, but I think that what we're really looking for is leadership that says, this country is going to go from A to B. And the way we're going to get to B is this way. And the people who are in the traditional organizations, this is how we're going to make the transition. Because what I think has been so difficult is that we're saying to the people, particularly who represent and who are focused on very low-wage workers, you need to be employees because that's the only way we have legal protections in America. And they're not crazy to want to give that up. And so what we have to do is say, you're right, and we're not going to give that up. This is the pathway toward protection for all workers. And in that process, we then will start this experimentation. I firmly believe that independent contractors in America must have the right to organize. And we must have labor laws that protect that right. And that right must not undermine in any way employees' rights to unionize. In the end, it's just workers. But I think that we don't have the leadership that's letting us bridge that. So let it be that we come back in a year and see that we actually start to have this plan, because the experimentation is ready, the ideas are ready, we all have our little policy papers and white papers, like check, check, check. Now what we need to do is get 51% of the votes to move this along and get some leadership to do it.
And in many ways, I think that the role that the federal government can play, there are at least two roles that I see that they can play. One is in addressing the issue that you just raised, the difficulty that providers have in unionizing. There's simple changes to antitrust law that can make that happen. But more broadly, even if we do craft a system where you can detach the benefits from the employment status or from the work organization, we still have to figure out a way to fund them.
Right.
And over there, I think that what the federal government can do is create policy that makes it easier to decentralize the ownership of capital. What I mean by this is that the examples that I gave of the sharing economy, Etsy, Airbnb, Lyft, there are others, Funding Circle for becoming a small business lender, Circle Up, an angel list for becoming a venture capitalist, a tiny venture capitalist. All of these are, in some sense, making individuals small business owners, tiny business owners in a way that we don't really think of small business owners. They're not employing people, but it's a business of one. To me, this is what is going to be the future of work. There's going to be a lot of pressure to move rapidly in this direction from automation, because a lot of the labor that is sought by large organizations is going to increasingly come from machines rather than humans. And so what's left for the humans is really to create new things and to sort of run their own businesses. And we were talking last evening about home ownership in the United States and how there were actions that were taken in the 40s, 50s, 60s that made a much larger fraction of the country owners of their homes. In some ways, this actually decentralized in many ways the ownership of capital in American society.
I think
but we've got to bring that kind of policy to more than just your home, to actually the things that generate your living for you.
But I would say that where we have to change as a country and get back to our de Tocquevillian roots is like enough of this atomistic individuals. Like you can't mitigate risk alone. It's just not true. And I think that what we're going to see is that if we uncouple work from an employer and we're starting to recognize the limitations of the ways that people did something, we can't just leave them out there on their own. And we have to really think about what are the nonprofit, civic, social organizations. This is not the task of business, and it's not the task of government to do it. It's the task of government to facilitate it, to enable it, to regulate it. But I don't know about you, but I want to have an opinion and a say over what organization I'm going to join. And I want to have a say about who's going to manage my benefits. Workers are exactly the same. And you want to have the information that lets you know they're doing a good job. And you want to know that there's competition, that if the group you joined didn't work for you, you could go somewhere else. But we're not having that conversation now because a lot of the conversation is being driven by Silicon Valley because they're creating the first platform. So yay, that's how it worked exactly in the 1880s with trains and factories. And then we had civil discourse. And that's what I think is this next era is civil discourse.
We're going to have to open it up for questions now from the audience. There's going to be mics coming around, so if you've got a question, here we are.
Do you guys mind if I take a picture of the audience while we're getting questions?
You have to get a release from all of them.
Yeah, well, I'll work on the release. I'm going to show, when I have grandkids, I'm going to show them all these pictures. I'm going to say, listen, people used to...
Hi, Chris Rollis in CSRA. I don't know if this panel is the right place to do it, but the whole idea of a guaranteed base income has not come into the conversation yet, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Why not abstract way, way higher than workers and benefits, I think, to guide the
I'd love to hear the panel comment on that, but just so you know, there is a session later on guaranteed basic income.
Okay, so let me say something that... Short form, yeah. So let me say something that the session that follows will disagree with violently. And, I think the philosophy of a universal basic income, giving people, say, $1,000 a month, as a guaranteed platform on which to do what they want to do from the government, is a good philosophy. It's an equalizing philosophy. I haven't yet seen a model that allows us to fund this in a realistic way. If you take this, $1,000 a month for every working age American, we're talking somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion a year. The federal budget last year was $3.8 trillion. So we're talking about a program that will be almost the size of the entire federal budget. And I think that not just is it going to be really difficult to fund, but we haven't had any good evidence yet that this is the right use of that funding if we can actually harness it, rather than giving some of that to other stakeholders in society who will then sort of do good things that will sort of move the needle on inequality.
Joseph, Sarah, did you want to chime in?
Happy to get another question.
All right, next question.
Hello, my name is Isabel Rizzo. I'm a creative director of PR agency based in Chicago, Paris, and CPO in Romania. I've been involved in the gig economy for 8 years, and I wonder, since you're all supports, I wish you existed when I first started. I've been doing everything on my own for 8 years. Do you feel that part of your role as teachers, educators, advocates, is really more of the mindset shift and self-empowerment? Because I feel that that's the direction, collectively, like even having this talk right here, is more about a different conversation on self. And how are you bringing that into your organizations, into your talks, into your classes?
I don't know if you want to take it because you haven't.
I think I'm understanding your question. Lyft, we definitely view ourselves as having a responsibility to not only drive the conversation, but also to ensure that the policy changes that are required follow the conversation. Because with just a conversation, this is great, but ultimately it's not doing any good, to your earlier point. I can't speak for the industry at large, but I think it ultimately comes down to the values of the company or the particular entries in the industry that you're talking about. And for our part, I'll say it on the stage right here. We would love to see a federal solution for portable benefits. And to the point that you were bringing up earlier, yes, I agree that at the local level it's much more likely for experimentation. But in terms of the business realities for gig economy platforms like Lyft, the only way to really make it feasible is to have a federal solution. So I think that's a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, but to the extent that Lyft is viewing what you're talking about, yes, we do view ourselves as having a responsibility not only to discuss this, but to be a leader.
And I'll just sort of jump in real quick with that.
There is sort of
I know, but there is there's a deeper point here, which is that our identities are often tied to our jobs, our communities are tied to our jobs, and our trajectory of what our aspirations are tied to our jobs. And those have to shift, and we have to create new institutions that give us a refreshed sense of identity, a substitute sense of community, and a sense for how we progress in our professional lives.
I think that's right. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone. Thank you to the audience.